I spent my childhood in a small fishing village in eastern Canada, surrounded on one side by the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and on the other by a dense taiga. The total area was just under 1.5 square kilometers, and the population was even smaller. Some of the residents lived along our main street, a road running through the town. The rest resided in former farmhouses that had been converted into homes after agriculture stopped being profitable. These houses were scattered among patches of forest. To sum it up, our village was embraced by the endless ocean and the vast forest, which covered at least 55% of Canada's land. I spent most of my life hunting in that forest, so you can imagine my excitement when my parents gave me a hunting dog. Sandy was a Scottish collie. Although they're better suited for watching over flocks of sheep on grassy plains than tracking rabbits and deer in a dense forest, I still took him with me on almost every trip. Sandy spent so much time with me that he got used to waking up before dawn. A couple of times, he even helped me catch small game like squirrels and rabbits in fairly large sections of the woods. I never considered Sandy my property, so I never treated him as if he belonged to me. He was family, a loyal companion, and my closest friend. I warmly remember how he would jump onto the front seat of the truck without needing any command, always ready to go with me anywhere in the forest. I can say with absolute certainty that I will never find another Sandy. Dog lovers will understand. So, it was October 30th, the first day of deer hunting season. I had been begging my parents for permission to take Sandy, my hunting gear, a few essentials, and spend a couple of days in one of my grandfather's cabins, which was located on the edge of an unmarked road deep in the woods. At first, my family was completely against the idea, but I wasn't about to miss the chance to hunt in an area untouched by poachers. After a couple of hours bouncing along in an old blue Ford, Sandy and I were already settling into the secluded cabin in the wilderness. In my youth, I spent almost all my free time in the forest. Very little could surprise me. Usually, any oddity could be explained scientifically. That's why, at first, I attributed Sandy's unusual behavior during the first 2 nights to distant sounds made by coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. After all, this was untouched land. Nature had settled in well. The first night passed relatively normally. I set up a bed for Sandy in the corner of the living room, near an old TV that must have been there since the early 90s. I thought it was a good idea to give him his own spot to rest, even though 9 times out of 10, he preferred to curl up next to me. Around 10 in the evening, Sandy turned toward the wooden front door and whimpered. I assumed he needed to go outside, so I opened the door to let him out. I wasn't worried at all about my best friend wandering too far from the cabin. But instead of stepping outside, Sandy just sat in the doorway, staring at the edge of the forest. I looked in the same direction for a few minutes, but eventually decided that he had probably just noticed some small animal lurking around our cabin. The rest of the night passed without incident, and Sandy slept soundly on my bed. The following night, I again dismissed his behavior as tension. That day, we had gone for a walk a couple of miles from the cabin when I suddenly heard branches snapping under something massive. I hoped it wasn't a moose. My rifle was no match for one. Something changed in Sandy's demeanor, but I didn't pay enough attention at the time. Lowering his head to the ground and baring his teeth, he growled into the empty woods. I decided to cut our trip short and try hunting another time, once whatever had startled him was gone, if he even wanted to go back out at all. But when we returned home, he started acting fussy. Even when I tried to take him outside, Sandy sat by the door and whimpered, making it clear he didn't want to go out. I didn't push him. If he wanted to relieve himself indoors, so be it. Sandy had never acted like this before. I could let 1 or 2 incidents slide if he truly didn't want to leave the house. It must have been a bear, I thought, locking the door and heading to bed. Then things got even worse. Sandy didn't eat all day. That morning, I had shot a rabbit. After that, my dog decided he'd had enough of being outside for the day and trudged back to the cabin, where he stayed for the rest of the day without stepping out even once. I cooked the rabbit, made some gravy, and offered Sandy a bit of meat. I didn't usually do that, but this was a special case. Maybe a treat will cheer him up, and tomorrow he'll be willing to go for a walk. Sandy didn't touch the food. Worse, he didn't even sniff it. Instead, he curled up with me on the couch and focused intently on the door. I wrapped an arm around him, and he lay his head on my leg, still staring at the door without blinking. After 3 hours of watching old VHS tapes on the grainy screen of the ancient television, Sandy whimpered and pressed himself closer to me. I know how silly it sounds. It was no longer the dog protecting me, but the other way around. Sandy was my family. If something outside scared him this much, I had to do something about it. Loading my shotgun with a .410 shell, I flung the door open, stepped into the doorway, and waited. I must have stood there for at least half an hour, staring into nothing. There was almost no sound, except for the faint buzzing of insects and the whisper of leaves in the cool autumn breeze. Moose aren't exactly graceful creatures, so if one were nearby, I would have heard it. 40 minutes passed. Then, out of nowhere, Sandy suddenly leaped up and bolted into the darkness of the forest, barking loudly. That shook me more than I'd like to admit, even though my dog was far from defenseless. Still, there were much bigger predators in the woods, ones that wouldn't mind making a meal out of Sandy as winter approached and food became scarce. I listened as his barking grew fainter and fainter, until it disappeared completely. I stood in the doorway for hours, my shotgun at the ready, waiting for Sandy to return. I waited so long that eventually, the sun began to peek through the treetops. Then, I sat on the porch and waited all day, struggling to stay awake, hoping that my dog would come back before nightfall. Sandy didn't return until 3 days later. The evening was foggy. Dusk was settling in, painting the sky a deep, dark blue. 3 days of searching had brought me nothing, and I was beginning to seriously consider heading home to get more supplies, and then staying at the cabin for a few more nights. I couldn't just leave Sandy out there. He must have been freezing and starving. The thought of him sitting somewhere waiting for me to come get him gnawed at me. I was packing my bag for tomorrow's search, thinking that the day after, I'd go home and ask my father to help me look. He was an old, gray-haired retiree, but I had no doubt that the moment he heard Sandy's name, he'd do everything in his power to find him. Luckily, Sandy came back before I could drive myself crazy. I saw him through the window, standing on the road about 10 meters from the cabin. Normally, he'd run right up to the door and tap it with his paw, but not this time. His eyes, like green pearls, stared at me from within the mist that clung to the cabin. For a second, I almost mistook him for a wild animal. I realized he could be injured, or worse. When I opened the door, he didn't run to me. Sandy just stood there, staring. To get him moving, I whistled. "Come on, Sandy," I called. "Come here, boy." He moved, strangely, as if his hips were dislocated. With every step, his legs twisted in different ways, like he had forgotten how to walk. His head hung low, but he didn't bare his teeth. He wasn't aggressive. How do I even describe the way he looked at me? It was a guilty look, like he had done something bad, and I was about to scold him for it. I worried that if his hips really were dislocated, climbing the tall step onto the porch would be difficult for him. But he managed. As he did, his back arched in an unnatural way, and one of his legs bent awkwardly under him. He sat down on the porch step, his eyes never leaving mine. And he didn't move. Not until I stepped out of the doorway and fully opened the door for him. Sandy walked straight to his bed. He didn't stop to sniff me. He didn't wait for me to pet him. Didn't jump on me like he always did. He just went to his bed, sat down on it, and kept watching me for a long time. I decided to finish watching my movie. A couple of times I called Sandy over, but he didn't react. His ears didn't twitch at the sound of my voice, or when I patted the couch beside me. Of course, I had missed my friend, but I wasn't going to drag him over by force. Deep down, I had this strange feeling, like maybe I shouldn't have let him inside, but I brushed it off as nonsense. A few hours later, I got ready for bed. Now, looking back, I realized something unsettling. Sandy hadn't blinked all day. He sat there like a statue, and when I turned off the light, his jade green eyes followed me until I stepped into my room and shut the door behind me. That night, I heard his footsteps. The soft clicking of claws against the wooden floor, slowly approaching my door. The steps were slow, but deliberate. Usually, Sandy would dart right up to me once he realized I had gone to bed and curl up beside me. But the sound stopped the moment he reached my door. I didn't think much of it, and soon drifted into a deep sleep. In the morning, I almost convinced myself I had dreamed it. Sandy was sitting in the exact same position as when I last saw him before bed, as if not a single muscle in his body had moved all night. He didn't even wag his tail. He followed me toward the kitchen and stopped near the open doorway, watching as I filled his bowl with supermarket kibble. On the way there, I noticed something else. That strange sway in his back half when he walked. Something was wrong. He looked different. As if, overnight, his body had somehow grown slightly longer. Sandy crouched low to the floor by the door, just like he had last night when he crept toward my bedroom. I thought he must be starving after spending days in the wilderness, but he didn't touch the food. Instead, he just stared at me, like he was calling me over. It should have been a given that he'd go to his bowl without needing me to say anything. But after a few seconds of this staring contest, my patience ran out, and I called him loudly. Sandy didn't budge. I felt something was wrong. I didn't want to get any closer, but I had to leave the kitchen somehow. My Sandy, the most harmless dog, whose worst crime was eating flies. With that thought in mind, I cautiously walked past him. He only followed me with his eyes, twisting his head in an unnatural way. That day, when I went hunting, I didn't find anything. The deer tracks were a couple of days old and disappeared where the natural trails faded into the underbrush. There were no insects buzzing, no birds chirping, not even the distant howls of coyotes. The only sounds were my breathing and the faint crunch of leaves beneath my boots. By the time the sun began to set, I turned back. Damn it. I should have just packed my things and left. As I neared the cabin, catching glimpses of it through the trees, I realized why there were no animals left in this part of the forest. Mass animal deaths are never a good sign. The surviving creatures are usually smart enough to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. Even domesticated cats still have the instinct not to drink water near their food. Think about it. If you saw a dead body by a stream, you'd assume it was contaminated and look for another source. Hundreds of gutted squirrels were scattered across the grass, forming an almost perfect circle. Many of them were skinned. Turning away to empty my stomach, I spotted another few dozen squirrels, turned completely inside out. I threw up several times as I walked around the ring of tiny organs and pulverized bodies. Not so much from the sight of it, but from the unbearable stench. I didn't know how long the squirrels had been there, but if I had stumbled upon them earlier, Sandy and I would have jumped into the car and gotten the hell out of there long ago. As I moved further, the line of corpses started thinning out. The largest body was that of a deer, lying just outside the satanic circle. Something had stripped the deer of its entire hide and draped it over a branch, as if to let it dry out a bit. I had no idea how long the deer had been lying there, but judging by the stench, it had been dead for quite some time. And yet, there wasn't a single damn fly in sight. The deer's head had been severed cleanly at the shoulders. Seeing that the carcass had been completely gutted, I broke into a run. Thankfully, the cabin wasn't far. Stopping just long enough to wipe my mouth with my sleeve, I glanced toward the house. Sandy was staring at me from the window. I shut the front door behind me and immediately started packing up my supplies, stuffing everything into boxes as fast as I could before nightfall. Navigating the winding road under the cover of darkness was dangerous. Kelly's Mountain had steep slopes, and in the pitch black, headlights wouldn't do much to stop me from slipping into a ravine and meeting a quick, inevitable death. I didn't want to stay another night, but I had no choice. By the time I was done, the sun had nearly set, and the sky had once again turned deep blue. I hadn't been paying much attention to Sandy. He just sat on his bed, silently watching me pack. Let him sit there, I thought. I'll toss his bed into the truck first thing in the morning, and by evening, we'll be home. Glancing at him again, I couldn't help but notice he had gotten even longer. That night, sleep didn't come easy. It was around 4 or 5 in the morning when I heard the whistling. Realizing that whoever, or whatever, had slaughtered the squirrels and gutted the deer might now be inside my house, I broke out in a cold sweat. Thank God my bedroom door didn't creak when I carefully nudged it open. Listening closely, I recognized the sound. It was my whistle, the same one I used to call Sandy. I gathered what little courage I had and peeked out from behind the door. The front door of the cabin was wide open. In the doorway stood the back half of Sandy, unnaturally stretched, curving around the frame. The rest of him was outside, and from beyond that open door, my own whistle called back to me. At some point, it bent down to the ground and dragged out, "Sandy!" in the most goddamn terrifying voice I had ever heard. I backed away in silence. I had no idea how long I waited, pressed against the door. What I did know was that my shotgun was still in my bag, the one I'd left hanging by the entrance. I waited until the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, then waited some more, probably until noon, before finally gathering the courage to open the door and make a run for my car. Sandy was gone. The front door was still wide open. The bowl of food remained untouched, but the fridge had been left open, and all the meat was missing. I didn't bother gathering Sandy's things. I just threw my bag over my shoulder, sprinted to the car, and turned the key in the ignition. I can't describe the feeling that overtook me when I realized I had to leave Sandy behind. I refused to think that he was already dead, and I wouldn't even entertain the thought that the thing I had let into my cabin had done to Sandy what it had done to the wild animals. Trying my best not to slide off into a ravine, I drove as fast as I could. It felt like I was trapped in a maze, doomed to circle back to the cabin. But when I finally spotted the asphalt road leading into town, relief washed over me. For the first time, I thought I might actually be safe. As soon as my tires hit the pavement, something hard slammed into the rear window, shattering it and sending glass shards all over the passenger seat. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a deer's head, lodged for a split second in the cracked glass before tumbling onto the back seat. I spent the rest of the drive sobbing, my fingers gripping the wheel so tightly they went white. Oh, how I wish I could end this story on a positive note. How I wish I could say I found Sandy, that he was home, waiting for me. I wish I could say that this was the end of the nightmare in those woods, and that in time, my traumatized mind would recover from it. But last night, I couldn't sleep, replaying every moment of that trip to Kellis Mountain over and over in my head. Realizing I wouldn't be getting any rest anytime soon, I just lay there, listening to the wind drifting through my open window. And I swear on my life, that from the edge of the woods I heard the whistle I used to call my dog,